Right, I think we'll make a start, everybody. So, welcome everybody to the webinar today, in which we're gonna talk a lot about, I think, some of the sort of buzzwords we heard from last year. I mean, around doing more with less, or maybe doing more with what we have. We will talk about AI as well because that's we need to do that for every webinar we have here. But today we're gonna really be talking to a strategic customer of Chartered, Mosaic Therapeutics, just about the sort of the journey in which they scaled their business in the UK with the thought really around the biotech industry, but also how from a finance perspective as well. I'm lucky to have Sam Quinn on the call today with me. My name, by the way, is Dominic Reed. I'm the Sales and Alliances Director here at Chartered. Chartered are a NetSuite partner that focus on AP automation inside of NetSuite. I'll come to more of that a little bit later. But if I could just ask you to introduce yourself, Sam, and maybe a little bit about Mosaic to kick things off.
Yeah, thanks, Dom, and hi, good to see you. And hello to everyone who's joined in on the webinar. My name is Sam Quinn. I'm a VP of Finance at Mosaic Therapeutics. Prior to my industry life, I was in the Big Four accounting firms for nearly a decade, before moving to a biotech startup out in California, San Diego. It was last year that I joined the leadership team at Mosaic. And Mosaic itself is an oncology drug discovery company, more specifically a precision combination therapy company based in Cambridge, England. Having spun out from the world-renowned Sanger Institute some 3 years ago, it's seen rapid growth in that time to the point where last year we successfully in-licensed two clinical stage assets, and are now plowing towards the clinic. I'm looking forward to talking today and hopefully giving you some insight into my NetSuite journey and how AP automation played a big role in that. So yeah, thanks, Dom. Good to see you all.
Great, great, thanks. Good introduction. Really interesting organisation that you're representing as well. So maybe if we just start with that, right? Maybe you can sort of tell us a little bit about, how you came to invest in NetSuite, firstly. What were some of the triggers there? And then what made you start to think about, how you can sort of automate your accounts payable function within the business?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, my NetSuite journey began as I entered into industry some 5 years ago, where I was tasked with leading a suitability or a feasibility study to make a recommendation on the ERP for that biotech. And I quickly shortlisted three ERPs, and having gone through extensive demonstrations and testing, it quickly became apparent that the front runner was NetSuite. And I suppose what's been validating since is speaking with other finance leaders in the biotech industry, with companies that are kind of similar size and scale to Mosaic and that company I was at in San Diego. NetSuite seems to be the common thread. So they seem to be a certain powerhouse in the biotech industry. Fortunately for me, as I joined Mosaic last year, they'd already had NetSuite. So again, more validation, which was great. And then pivoting to the AP side, in my mind, as like a finance leader, one of the key business processes that needs to be looked at closely as well is accounts payable. And what I thought I'd do is just talk about some of the trigger points within accounts payable. And I think there's a helpful graphic that we have in the slides that covers these kind of triggers that we were thinking about. Yeah, here we go. This is a great kind of bucket of problems. And I'll just talk to some of these briefly. Because when I think about vendor onboarding, certainly before any kind of solutions on board integrated or implemented into NetSuite, you have like several emails with vendors. You're trying to scramble with PDF documents in your accounts inbox for your company, and those PDFs will have key data like address information, tax information, VAT certificates, or in America W-9s, and also bank information. And you can imagine scenarios where your team are trying to collate that data to put it into NetSuite manually. It takes time. Vendors can get frustrated. Data can get lost. It's unsecure. And so that was one of my first triggers, is the time taken and the errors as a result of this manual intervention around vendor onboarding. Also, is as well with biotechs in particular, they tend to want to move fast and spend fast, and so vendor onboarding is often an afterthought. And so you end up in scenarios where, your teams are working with unvetted vendors and vendors that aren't on your approved vendor listing. And so
Right.
that afterthought can also cause all sorts of breakdown in vendor relationships too, because we can't make the payments because they're not onboarded. So that's just a flavor of the vendor onboarding kind of problems we had. Um, and then on invoice processing too, probably one of my biggest bugbears is the time taken manually to process invoices.
Right.
I can get onto the complexities of why invoices can be complex in biotech, but just if I stick to the triggers of the manual involvement is around, you take the invoice from the inbox and you have to index it, you process it in NetSuite with, invoice dates, due dates, invoice numbers, the GL account, all that can be manual and take anything up to 5 minutes to do an invoice. And that's what we were finding on average, AP clerk taking 5 minutes to just process one invoice. Imagine trying to scale that in a biotech that wants to run fast. It's very difficult and can often lead to error too, because of just repetitive, mundane tasks.
Mm.
Also, this graphic talks about duplicate delayed payments too. I mean, I often find that transposition errors are quite common when it's manual processing, and that
Right.
can lead to like credit balances with vendors trying to reconcile account balances and then making payment corrections. Again, I'm just talking more time, more processing, more delays, vendor relationship breakdown, and then finally, the lack of a three-way match ultimately results in this lack of confidence that I have in knowing that you're paying for goods received,
Yeah.
and that the coding of the invoice is, driven by that approved coding of a purchase order. So just not having that confidence, just again, results in more time spent reviewing these things. I guess what underpins all this though is human error, right? And
Right.
it's trying to mitigate that human error. But anyway, Dom, hopefully that's a kind of brief overview of
Yeah.
my journey of NetSuite, but also those triggers that I faced when
Yeah.
thinking why an AP solution was needed.
Yeah. No, that's really useful. Thanks. So let's get actually into, what are the complexities specifically in the biotech type companies that come around that AP process that are maybe a little bit different to other industries that you might come across.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're really early startup biotech, I don't want to oversell the complexity. It's not that; it's relatively simpler. But as we know, the moment you have some preclinical data, you then want to race to clinic, and therefore your scale it scales quick and you go quick, and
Right.
so the complexities ramp up with that. So to give you some examples. What one of a very important non-dilutive form of funding for biotechs, certainly in the United Kingdom, is the R&D tax credits.
Mm.
And so being able to accurately record the R&D that's being spent on these scientific unknowns and the development towards the solution, you've got to be able to capture that data and be able to stand up to scrutiny with HMRC or whichever tax authority you're working with. So that's one example, R&D tax credits. Another one is government grants, for example.
Mm.
If you get given funding from a government agency, you need to be able to report, and it may be just for a specific candidate, you need to be able to report very accurate data of the work done towards that particular grant piece of work. So again, being able to capture that data, have the accuracy and the completeness is really important and can be complex.
Mm.
Also, there's clinical trial costs. If you're racing towards the clinic, you have to have the architecture in place to be able to track clinical trial costs, in particular with these big CRO contracts. It's very important to be able to understand the funding against those CROs.
Yeah.
Again, as well as I think about other significant spend, which has complex tracking. If the discovery biology team will ultimately have big equipment in the wet labs, and so ensuring you have accurate fixed asset management, which may have complex lab equipment to track. And then finally, to give you another example, one final example is assuming you're going towards the clinic, you'll
Mm.
have some form of manufacturing of drug. Now, certainly when you're talking about drugs, there's a very important regulation to follow, tracking of costs in your supply chain to be able to get to the point of producing an actual drug into the trial. So again, inventory management, manufacturing, very
Mm.
important. complex. So that's just a flavor of the complexities you're faced with as you scale in a biotech.
Yes, there's a lot of almost non-standard, right? Would that be a good word to use, right? Along there.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a fair assessment.
Yeah. So, okay, so let's get back, onto your sort of journey. So, as I understand, you initially purchased a third-party solution, right, to do AP. So, why did that not work, or for all of your requirements? And what made you sort of then go to look for something that was more of a integrationless or native solution inside of NetSuite?
Yeah, and we did. You're right. We started with a third party solution, actually in my prior role, but the learnings are,
Yeah.
um, and really the experience with the third party solution,
Mm.
and the sort of the bad experience I should start with is it
Yeah.
stems from the integration, and you often with these third party products, and I'll just talk from my experience. I guess that's the point,
Okay.
right? Is you're promised this like seamless integration,
Mm.
no reconciling issues. Uh, it'll work. It's built. It'll work on NetSuite. Don't worry. You're kind of giving these promises, and then you get into the actual operation of it, and you're faced with everything they said you wouldn't have.
Mm.
So you end up having to design and build like reconciliation controls over the sync because the sync will inevitably fail somehow, and then you spend time troubleshooting, finding the problem, and then the solution isn't always simple. You have to contact the third party; they'll help you with the solving the sync. And
Mm.
so that was my experience of the third party tools is that having to then log in. Oh, and I should just add as well,
Yeah.
having to log into another portal, another separate set of security administration around a different solution, but that does interface with your ERP NetSuite. Again, I'm just not a fan of having to go into a different login, different passwords. Um, I I think that experience, when I contrast to what, and we'll get onto it, what
Yeah.
charter, just being able to log into NetSuite and you're in the solution.
Mm.
Um, I personally can't see a scenario where I go back to using these integrations because they're just more for me they're more hassle than what they're worth.
Yeah, it's almost I know there's certain things with certain industries where you might need to use an external solution, but you should always try to be inside of NetSuite because that's sometimes the reason people board it is the one version of the truth. So no, I completely get that.
One stop
So
shop.
yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, exactly, exactly. So let's look at, your when you are sort of looking at those other alternative solutions, right, than a third-party solution. When you went through that process of evaluation, what was your key criteria? And ultimately, why did you select Charted to solve those challenges?
Yeah, good question. And I mean, it was a relatively long list of criterion, but I'll give
Yeah,
you I'll give you like my top 10 or something.
yeah,
But and I'd recommend anyone to kind of use these criteria because
mm,
for me it worked and it's worked a few times now. But
yeah,
um, first and foremost, and we've been over it, is it's the integration-less piece. So the tool that we wanted
mm,
had to be integration-less, and I guess to be clear on what that means in my mind
yeah,
is maybe I've already said it, but is I log into NetSuite and the tool it's like I'm still using NetSuite from a user end
yeah,
experience. I'm not using anything else. I'm just using NetSuite. So that was the first key criteria for me. The
mm,
next one is, and I know some third-party tools and maybe even other like native solutions don't necessarily do this, but it's got to be built on the latest NetSuite technology.
right,
And I guess with that, they need a proven track record that because I know NetSuite push out an annual update. I need to have the
yeah,
confidence that whatever's going to be in NetSuite, built in NetSuite, is going to be continually upgraded, enhanced to keep up with those updates. No business continuity issues, right? That had to
yeah,
be another box tick for me. Um, we've said it already, but another criteria, key one, is it's built for NetSuite. A lot of
yeah,
these party tools are, they work with NetSuite, but
yeah,
the architecture isn't always accommodated fully. You'll have to make compromise, or you will be missing some. You may have to omit some data in the architecture.
right,
So for me, it was really important that whatever that solution was, it's for it. The starting point was how does this work in NetSuite? Not we can cover several ERPs and don't worry, we got you, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And with that, I guess, in terms of like troubleshooting, support, I wanted the whole solution that I was getting to be managed by one software vendor. So
Yeah.
imagine, invoice scanning is a good example, I guess. Like,
Yeah.
I know that there's some solutions where if you have an OCR scanning issue,
Yeah.
you have, they may outsource that actually to someone else. So
Right.
you may
Yeah.
go to like the software vendor, say, hey, I've got an OCR scanning issue, and they go, okay, we need to get in touch with X to like
Yeah.
troubleshoot. So I needed it to be a one-stop shop, and
Yeah.
and the provider had to be my troubleshooting, and it had to be seamless.
Got
So
it.
that was kind of an important point too. Um, and sticking on OCR scanning, and I know Chartered has an AI powered one, which I think we'll talk about later. But
Yeah.
the scanning tool itself, and this is relevant in particular to biotech, it had to handle complex invoices.
Mhm.
There are invoices that can be pages and pages long, and so that tool had to be able to cope with volume and
Yeah.
complexity. So that was also very important, especially when I go back to scale and being able to go quick within the biotech industry. Um, and then again, thinking back on that sort of P2P process or procure to pay process,
Yeah.
that vendor onboarding. I know that I've demoed in my time some tools that do vendor onboarding, and
Yeah.
again through another portal, like you're asking the vendor to log into another portal
Yeah.
to their details. I didn't want that. I wanted simplicity. I wanted it being in NetSuite. So the vendor management piece had to be in NetSuite as well. Um, I guess finally, because I've given you quite a few there, but finally, um, another important part of control
Mhm.
is approval workflows, and
Right.
especially when it comes to ensuring costs are in the right buckets, going back
Mhm.
to those kind of complexities. And so I wanted the solution to be able to manage a complex approval workflow that sat on top of all these, vendor onboarding,
Yeah.
invoicing, purchase orders, and even if they could offer things like journal entry approvals and things like that. So I wanted that complex approval workflow to be accommodated too. So that's Dom. There's a short or long list of reasons or criteria that I set
Yeah.
out in. I guess you asked the second part of the question of why chartered, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, why chartered? I mean, first and foremost, chartered fully met just the criteria I set out
Yeah.
then. And interestingly, weren't actually many other solutions that did. So the shortlist was relatively short.
Mhm.
But also in talking to you guys, I felt like the product was ready for the biotech industry. There wasn't like the more nuances that were needed. You kind of had like a bottom-up built product in NetSuite for biotech. That's just how it felt going
Mhm.
through that process. Um, and then whilst talking to you guys, I also got this. I got the impression, and it's proven now in the post go live support that you guys know NetSuite, that you have a deep understanding of NetSuite, and you're very, very experienced in the ERP itself. So, when it comes to a problem, there's no problem you can't solve. Um, cliched, I know, but it's true.
Mhm.
Um, and then finally, because I've worked with you guys for in kind of two experiences now, what I've
Yeah.
seen evolve in that time I've worked with you is that you do have this impressive roadmap of like
Yeah.
product enhancement, and always coming with some product enhancements that I may not have necessarily even thought of, and it's actually helping in terms of like a return on investment. So yeah, really pleased with Chartered so far, and I guess that answers your question as to why I chose you guys.
Excellent. So I guess let's go back a little bit to, the ROI statement. So what was the measurable? Because I think it's good. You kind of already mentioned some numbers previously, but what was the measurable ROI? But also what was the ROI that's not necessarily a metric, right? So just talk to me a little bit about those things.
Yeah, so measurable ROI, I think the obvious one, and I kind of I guess I mentioned in the triggers that I was having with AP, goes back
Yeah.
to that processing time, and it was a killer, right? 5 minutes an invoice, the team are pulling their hair out, and
Yeah.
we need to process. Say we went from 200 invoices a month to 800. Imagine spending 5 minutes per invoice for 800
Yeah.
invoices.
Right. Yeah.
So I think well, I know the measurable ROI is in this space, right? Because
Mm.
Now I've seen invoices can be processed in less than 30 seconds. Even
Yeah,
the simplest of invoices that have a very straightforward three-way match can be done within 10 seconds. So imagine the scalability of invoice processing. Just that itself,
yeah,
so that's an easy measurable ROI for
yeah,
me. Already, just that in itself, in isolation, kind of sells it. But the
yeah,
non-measurable piece, that's a good thought because I guess the one of the triggers I mentioned, one of the consequences of those triggers was that vendor relationship breakdown, right?
yeah,
And what I'm seeing now is a drastic vendor relationship improvement. We're
mm,
making on-time payments, we're making accurate payments, we'll be able to the time that my team have saved in processing, they're able to work with vendors, to have dialogue with vendors, better dialogue with vendors, and so that ultimately leads to favorable pricing, favorable payment terms,
yeah,
credit terms. So I guess there's probably some measurable ROI in there as well, but like the
yeah, right,
non-measurable piece is that relationship piece with the vendors. But also,
yeah,
if I think internally, internally too, the team are just far more empowered. They're doing more meaningful tasks. So there's a much more, and that's not just the finance team. I'm talking like the whole workforce. They're now involved in the approval workflows. They're getting
yeah,
visibility into bills on a real time basis. Um, and the vendors are treating them better. So there's just this intangible value of improvement across the workforce in utilizing AP automation with Chartered.
excellent. Yeah. So one last question for you, and then I'll come in to talk a little bit about Chartered because we've mentioned this name but not really gone into it.
Yeah.
So how do you see the role of the AP clerk in the future, specifically in the biotech industry?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's
Yeah,
pertinent because this kind of topic comes up on a wider scale around what's
right.
AP, what's automation doing to
Mm,
kind of my profession but to keep this specific to the AP clerk and AP automation, the way I see AP automation is that this is just a new team member. It's not
yeah,
replacing anyone in the team. It's just a new team member.
mm,
I joke and call it Jeffrey or something. It's just someone, it's a tool being used by our team members to
right.
empower them. I mentioned it earlier, going back to that non-measurable ROI.
Mm,
It's to empower them to work on more strategic areas of the business to help in different
mm,
areas. So I see it still growing. AP automation is going to continue to grow. It's going to get better, more intelligent, especially with the AI empowered piece in like invoice AI.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, I think the role of the clerk will just become more towards the strategic thinking side than that mundane, repetitive, the day is the same every time, just
mm,
processing. So I hopefully that empowers them to do more things within the finance team itself.
excellent. Yeah, that's really great. Thanks for answering those questions for us. I think we can move to the next slide. Well, actually, before we go there, did we have any questions come through? We had one. Oh, so we had a question here. If this is for you, of course, Sam, why do you think NetSuite is the powerhouse solution in the biotech space?
Yeah, that's a good question. Its adaptability is
Right.
powerful, but also so like you can start off with being preclinical.
Yeah.
It will, like I said earlier, it will do that fixed asset management. Um, it will track those program costs well, but then
Yeah.
you want to quickly move into an inventory management system
Mm.
so you can that easily gets integrated. No, I don't use the word integrated actually. That's a bad word to use, but you
Yeah.
get implemented into NetSuite or
Yeah.
turned on, say, into NetSuite. And so what I'm talking about really is the scalability of NetSuite itself. It
Yeah.
can from 0 to 100 quickly with your business, and that's the frictionless piece that I like the look of
Yeah.
when I was in that evaluation process.
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. Thanks for answering that. So I'm gonna use the last 4 minutes just to tell the audience who Chartered is. So Chartered started as an alliance partner in North America, and then suddenly, over the time, realized there was the platform that NetSuite is. There was an opportunity to provide more automation around the accounts payable area, and actually built a solution inside of the four walls of NetSuite to do that. And now that's what we do. We're a software vendor to cover that, but we are a strong believer in that. That sort of process should sit within inside of NetSuite. So everything we do, as you probably heard from Sam, is all native inside of NetSuite. Okay, so as you can see here, so a few of our customers that are local to us here in EMEA, but over the world we've got around 1,000 global customers. So yeah, you can go back to the next slide now, please. So some of this has been actually covered, but as you can see, we cover most of the sort of AP automation process. So really, we believe, everything really starts with onboarding that vendor, as Sam was talking about just now. But we believe that should be done, as I said, inside of the four walls of NetSuite. So that whole relationship between yourself and your vendors is done from inside the four walls of NetSuite. Okay, so that's the first piece we do. Then we have Invoice AI. Invoice AI is our solution for actually scanning those invoices and managing those invoices inside of NetSuite. It does some clever stuff with AI. The AI is really there to enable you as a user to be able to manage some of those sort of invoices, which are a little bit non-standard, like Sam was talking about there. Then we have our approval solution as well that enables you to build some approvals around that AP flow. And right at the end here, we have our accrual automation, which is ultimately allowing you to actually close your books quicker. So that's who we are and what we're doing. Again, we only had a few minutes for this, but if you want to learn any more, we'll be in touch with you with sort of follow-up information anyway. So good news is that we're actually, we've had our global customer base around for a while, and we've been servicing that customer base from the US. And just recently we made the announcement that we're sort of expanding into EMEA. We've opened our office in London. And what that means for you is to support really our customers, our partners, and to support NetSuite themselves as well in the market. That means we build stronger EMEA relationships. You've got people on the ground, so we've basically under one of the first hires here to really drive the commercial strategic go-to-market, but also we have technical resources on the ground now as well, which means we'll also be launching future products to better address the regional pain points. So that's a bit about us and the organization and where we're going. I think that was the last slide, as far as I'm aware. I think it was. Next slide. No, must be. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Yeah, so I think that was the last slide. If you've got any more questions, we'll be in touch with you anyway. We'll send you a follow-up. We'll send you a recording of the session. There will also be, we're going to send you a guide, an AP guide out as well in due course as well. So everybody, I really appreciate you taking the time, especially for your finance guys, because this is a busy time of the year for you. So if you'd spend 30 minutes with us today, I really appreciate it. So thanks for your time. And Sam, it's been great talking to you. Thanks for getting into the details with us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tom. Good to see you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.